From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. One last thought on this student loan question, Monet. If the Supreme Court does end up blocking President Biden's plan, then I think that throws this question back into the political debate. And I've been kind of watching the polls on this as we go, but the latest is the exit poll, the election exit poll, and opinion of a Biden student debt relief plan. 50% of voters say they approve, 47% say they disapprove, and understandably, of those that approve, 82% voted for Democratic candidates. Of those who disapprove, 85% voted for Republican candidates. And Monet, I wonder what you make of these poll numbers. I mean, they seem to vary depending on how the question is asked. But the political dynamics may be shifting because there are now millions of people who have applied for the forgiveness, and yet none of the money has gone out the door yet. There's nothing that's actually happening that would rile up the people who are opposed.
Right. I do think that when President Biden first announced student loan forgiveness, there was a pretty big backlash, in part because of the size of the program. He was originally going to forgive a significantly larger amount of debt per debt holder. And so people saw the eye-popping numbers and the sense that people who took out these massive and in some occasions completely worthless loans to pay for master's degree programs and totally excessive things were going to have their debt completely forgiven, and that benefit was going to accrue disproportionately to higher income people because they're the ones who have that massive amount of debt. And so that's when the sort of public outcry was largest. I do think it probably has made a difference that the administration has reduced the number in terms of the amount of debt that it's willing to forgive. I think that people probably also did kind of price the policy in, as you're implying. There now are kind of definite interests of people who have a stake in the policy going forward. But I don't know. I think that there's probably a lot to be read into what you said about how the question is phrased. Obviously, people understand that there are people who are in a bad position because they have quite a lot of debt and they feel some sympathy for them. But I think broadly, Americans still think that the policy is deeply unfair and that if it is able to move forward, the Biden administration will take some hit for that. Obviously, it's one of those policies where you have a narrow interest group that really wants you to pursue the policy and benefits from it, but then you have a much broader public that isn't as deeply affected by the policy but generally opposes it. And so I would bet that it still is going to be a net negative for the Biden administration. They probably understand the balance of what it can do for them politically and have decided to push forward on it, but I think it's a mistake on their end.
Finally, the inflation report has been a little bit swamped by the political news and the election news. But the Labor Department said Thursday that the Consumer Price Index is up 7.7% over the past year. That is down a little bit from the peak of 9.1% in June, but still very elevated. And core inflation, excluding food and energy, was 6.3% year over year. Alicia, as you look at these inflation figures in this report, what is it that you would pick out?
Well, I think one thing that's worth noting is that even while inflation is falling, the price level isn't actually falling overall. Prices are continuing to rise, just albeit at a slower rate. And I think one other thing that jumped out at me is how the shelter index, which has continued to increase. Now, that is often a lagging indicator in that often the numbers that it measures are based on previous rent increases or housing price increases. So we'll likely see those in the coming months decline, as we have been hearing about that the rent increases are starting to stall out and housing prices in most areas of the country are actually plateauing, or in some areas like California's Bay Area are actually starting to fall off. But I think if you look at the food prices, the energy prices, the things that actually hit people really hard, people really aren't getting much relief here. Prices, for instance, food away from home increased by 0.9 percentage points, it's been increasing basically since the spring at this very rapid rate. And some of that's due to increasing wage and increasing labor costs that are now starting to get passed on to consumers. And potentially as the labor market starts to, slacken a little bit, maybe the wage increases will actually fall. And so you'll start to see, again, disinflation. So prices won't increase as much as they have been. But I think most people are just getting sticker shock wherever they go, grocery store or restaurant, gas station, the places where people frequent the most, they're really getting hammered. So it's not really much consolation to the extent that, oh, used car trucks and prices are starting to fall. Well, most people aren't going to go out and buy a used car. And most people aren't buying used car trucks, every year. That may help people whose cars break down and then they're in the market for a new car. But the things that everyone spends on, and especially the lower and middle income Americans do the most, those are still hitting people pretty hard.
The 2 points that I would make is even if you assume that we are past peak inflation, the question still seems to be outstanding, Monet, about how sticky it will end up being. And I would point to the core inflation figures, the monthly rise. And remember back in July when President Biden was celebrating that the overall monthly figure was 0% consumer price index rise. But the core inflation figure was 0.3, and that was still a drop. And then in August, we had 0.6. In September, we had 0.6. Now in October, we have 0.3 again. It is not hard to imagine that next month it might be 0.6 again. It seems like this inflation has gotten a little bit embedded in the economy, and it will be fascinating to see how fast that falls off or whether the Fed has a real fight on its hands. The other point I would just make is related to wages. Inflation-adjusted weekly earnings are now down 3.7% in the last year, Monet. And that would take a while to make up to even get back to the baseline before the inflation kicked in. And if you start thinking about the 2024 presidential election, the classic question for an incumbent seeking re-election is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And again, it's not hard to imagine that if we don't get any makeup growth in those wage figures, that a lot of people in 2024 will answer that question and say, no, I'm not better off. And I think there's a risk of President Biden misreading the results of these midterms and keeping straight on with his agenda without really addressing the pain that voters are feeling.
Right. To your first question about how sticky is inflation going to prove, I do think that's exactly the one that investors have been asking themselves. And they seem a little bit optimistic in the sense that, yes, we still are seeing prices increase month over month, but that pace of increase has started to slow, basically in keeping with what the best reasonable hopes would have been. And so I do think that a lot of people underestimated how high inflation would go and probably were a little optimistic for a few months about what the Fed would have to do in order to start bringing it down. But for the past few months, at least, I think that if you had asked people to guess, how soon are we going to start to see pretty quick declines in year-over-year inflation, the results that we've actually seen would be in line with what they would have guessed, or maybe even with what the most optimistic guesses would have been, which is why investors are starting to feel good about the possibility that the Fed might slow the pace of its interest rate increases, which Chairman Powell has already indicated, and maybe they're even starting to think that the top rate of the federal funds rate is going to be a little bit lower than people might have thought it would have to go a few months ago. So that's kind of the state of play in terms of how people are reading the CPI numbers as far as I see it. But I think that, there's a lot more concern on the question of wages and when are consumers going to start actually feeling relief. To your point, you do still have these kind of real wage declines and people really are experiencing that. And, that played out at the ballot box to a certain degree. And that's not a concern that's going to go away anytime soon. But I do think that the underlying problem here is that the Fed's interest rate increases, which are curbing demand, are not being matched by any kind of productivity-enhancing policies. We can all look back to 40 years ago, the last time we struggled with an inflation problem of this scale, and we know that not only did you have the Federal Reserve raising interest rates very high, but you also had the Reagan administration cutting taxes and basically encouraging policies that would drive productivity growth and help wages to grow and sort of keep up with the rising prices. So far, all we have is the interest rates, and from the looks of the Biden administration, that's not going to change anytime soon. And so it may prove that even as inflation starts to slow, we're not seeing the wage gains that are going to make consumers feel like we've actually gotten out of the trap.
Thank you, Monet and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.